Question 1. System analysis indicates that a service provider is planning a large-scale deployment of Cisco unlicensed small cells in the 5 GHz band across a metropolitan area. The primary goal is to offload mobile traffic and enhance user experience. However, the deployment area is known to have several active radar systems operating in adjacent or overlapping frequency bands. Which of the following implementation strategies best ensures compliance with FCC regulations for unlicensed devices while minimizing the risk of harmful interference? Option A. Rely on the inherent interference mitigation capabilities of the unlicensed small cell hardware, assuming that the FCC certification process adequately covers all potential interference scenarios. Option B. Deploy the small cells with default configurations and address any potential interference issues reactively if complaints are received from licensed spectrum users or regulatory bodies. Option C. Implement robust dynamic frequency selection, DFS, and transmit power control, TPC, mechanisms within the small cell configuration, ensuring they are properly calibrated to detect and avoid radar signals as mandated by FCC Part 15 rules. Option D. Prioritize maximum transmit power for optimal coverage and user experience, and only implement DFS and TPC if specifically instructed by the FCC after a formal investigation. The correct answer is C. Implement robust dynamic frequency selection, DFS, and transmit power control, TPC, mechanisms within the small cell configuration, ensuring they are properly calibrated to detect and avoid radar signals as mandated by FCC Part 15 rules. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in unlicensed small cell deployments, ensuring compliance with evolving regulatory requirements for spectrum usage and interference mitigation without compromising service quality or deployment timelines. The challenge lies in balancing the need for rapid deployment with the imperative to adhere to the specific technical and operational rules set forth by the relevant regulatory body. In this case, the FCC in the United States, as implied by the exam's focus on U.S. regulations. Misinterpreting or overlooking these regulations can lead to significant penalties, service disruptions, and reputational damage. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves proactively engaging with the FCC's Part 15 rules, specifically focusing on the requirements for unlicensed devices operating in the 5 GHz band. This includes understanding and implementing mechanisms for dynamic frequency selection, DFS, and transmit power control, TPC, to avoid causing harmful interference to licensed services, such as radar systems. Best professional practice dictates a thorough understanding of these rules before deployment, integrating compliance measures into the design and configuration of the small cell solution, and establishing ongoing monitoring to ensure continued adherence. This proactive stance minimizes risk and ensures the long-term viability of the unlicensed small cell deployment. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that because the spectrum is unlicensed, there are no significant regulatory obligations beyond basic device certification. This overlooks the FCC's mandate under Part 15 to prevent harmful interference. Failing to implement DFS and TPC, or incorrectly configuring them, directly violates these rules and can lead to interference complaints and enforcement actions. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize rapid deployment and service availability above all else, deferring regulatory compliance checks to a later stage, or relying solely on the hope that no interference issues will arise. This is professionally irresponsible and ethically unsound, as it knowingly exposes the deployment to regulatory risk and potential harm to existing licensed users. The FCC's regulations are designed to protect critical services, and ignoring them is a clear failure of professional duty. A third incorrect approach is to implement generic interference mitigation techniques without specific consideration for the FCC's requirements for unlicensed devices in the 5 GHz band. While some techniques might be beneficial, they may not adequately address the specific DFS and TPC mandates, which are crucial for coexisting with radar systems. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the precise regulatory landscape and a failure to apply the most effective and compliant solutions. Professional reasoning. Professionals tasked with implementing Cisco service provider mobile, unlicensed small cell solutions must adopt a risk-aware and compliance-first mindset. The decision-making process should begin with a comprehensive review of all applicable FCC regulations, particularly Part 15 for unlicensed operations. This should be followed by a thorough technical assessment to identify how the proposed small cell solution will interact with existing spectrum users. Implementation plans must integrate compliance measures from the outset, including robust DFS and TPC configuration. Ongoing monitoring and auditing are essential to ensure sustained compliance. When faced with ambiguity, seeking clarification from regulatory bodies or legal counsel specializing in telecommunications law is a prudent step. Question 2. Investigation of process optimization for a service provider's unlicensed small cell deployment reveals a need to enhance network performance. Which approach best balances the drive for increased capacity and coverage with the absolute priority of adhering to the regulatory framework governing unlicensed spectrum usage in the United States? Option A. Rely on vendor-provided default configurations for all small cells and conduct regulatory compliance checks only when prompted by a formal complaint or audit. Option B. Implement a phased deployment strategy that incorporates continuous monitoring of key performance indicators, including transmit power, channel occupancy, and interference levels, against established regulatory limits, with automated alerts for any deviations. Option C. Aggressively increase transmit power and reduce intercell coordination intervals to maximize data throughput across all deployed small cells, assuming that minor regulatory excursions are acceptable for competitive advantage. Option D. Focus optimization efforts solely on increasing the number of small cells deployed in dense urban areas, deferring any regulatory compliance checks until after the initial deployment phase is complete. The correct answer is B. Implement a phased deployment strategy that incorporates continuous monitoring of key performance indicators, including transmit power, channel occupancy, and interference levels, against established regulatory limits, with automated alerts for any deviations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge in optimizing the deployment of unlicensed small cells within a service provider's network. The core difficulty lies in balancing the rapid expansion of coverage and capacity, driven by market demand and competitive pressures, with the stringent regulatory requirements governing the use of unlicensed spectrum. Service providers must ensure that their deployments not only meet performance objectives, but also adhere strictly to the technical parameters and operational guidelines mandated by the relevant regulatory bodies to avoid penalties, service disruptions, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to select a process optimization strategy that is both effective and compliant. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, data-driven methodology that integrates regulatory compliance from the outset. By establishing clear performance metrics that explicitly include adherence to regulatory limits, e.g., transmit power, channel utilization, interference mitigation, the provider ensures that optimization efforts are inherently aligned with legal obligations. This proactive stance minimizes the risk of noncompliance, which can lead to significant fines, forced network shutdowns, and loss of customer trust. Furthermore, a phased rollout with continuous monitoring and feedback loops allows for agile adjustments, ensuring that performance gains do not inadvertently violate regulatory boundaries. This approach demonstrates a commitment to responsible network operation and long-term sustainability. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on maximizing throughput without considering regulatory constraints is professionally unacceptable. This would likely lead to exceeding power limits or causing excessive interference, directly violating the technical rules governing unlicensed spectrum usage. Such a failure would expose the provider to regulatory sanctions and could necessitate costly remediation efforts. Another incorrect approach that neglects to establish baseline regulatory compliance metrics before initiating optimization is also professionally flawed. This oversight means that the optimization process might inadvertently push parameters beyond acceptable limits without detection, until a compliance audit or interference complaint arises. This reactive approach is inefficient and risky. Finally, an approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or informal feedback for optimization, rather than structured data collection and analysis, fails to provide the necessary rigor. This can lead to suboptimal performance and, more critically, a lack of auditable proof of compliance, making it difficult to defend against regulatory scrutiny. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a thorough understanding of the applicable regulatory framework for unlicensed spectrum use. This includes identifying all relevant technical parameters, reporting requirements, and enforcement mechanisms. For implementing any optimization strategy, a comprehensive risk assessment should be conducted, specifically evaluating potential compliance issues. The chosen optimization methodology must embed compliance checks and balances throughout its lifecycle, from planning and deployment to ongoing operation and maintenance. Regular training for technical staff on regulatory requirements and best practices for unlicensed spectrum management is also crucial. Question 3. What factors determine the permissible operational parameters for implementing Cisco service provider mobile unlicensed small cell solutions within the United States, specifically concerning spectrum usage and interference mitigation? Option A. The physical characteristics of the small cell hardware, irrespective of regulatory compliance for unlicensed spectrum. Option B. The availability of unlicensed spectrum bands without verification of specific operational restrictions or interference potential. Option C. The service provider's internal network capacity and projected user demand for the small cell coverage area. Option D. Adherence to FCC Part 15 rules, including power limits, antenna specifications, and spectrum sharing protocols to prevent harmful interference with licensed services. The correct answer is D. Adherence to FCC Part 15 rules, including power limits, antenna specifications, and spectrum sharing protocols to prevent harmful interference with licensed services. Explanation. The professional challenge in this scenario lies in balancing the rapid deployment of unlicensed small cell solutions with the imperative to comply with the specific regulatory framework governing their operation within the United States. This requires a nuanced understanding of how different regulatory bodies, such as the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, define and enforce rules for unlicensed spectrum usage, particularly concerning interference and public safety. Careful judgment is needed to avoid actions that could lead to regulatory penalties, service disruption, or harm to existing licensed services. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to the FCC's Part 15 rules for unlicensed devices. This includes understanding and implementing mechanisms to mitigate interference, such as power limits, antenna restrictions, and adherence to spectrum sharing protocols. By focusing on these established regulatory requirements, service providers ensure that their small cell deployments are legal, do not cause harmful interference to incumbent services, like licensed cellular bands or public safety communications, and contribute to a stable and predictable radio frequency environment. This proactive compliance is essential for long-term operational success and avoids costly remediation or legal challenges. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on maximizing coverage without considering interference mitigation fails to meet the FCC's requirements. Specifically, exceeding power limits or using antennas not compliant with Part 15 rules would constitute a direct violation, potentially leading to fines and cease and desist orders. Another incorrect approach that ignores the potential for interference with licensed services, particularly critical public safety communications, demonstrates a disregard for regulatory mandates and ethical responsibilities. This could result in significant disruption to essential services, leading to severe legal and reputational consequences. A third incorrect approach that relies on assumptions about spectrum availability without verifying compliance with FCC regulations for unlicensed operation risks deploying equipment that is not permitted, thereby violating the spirit and letter of the law. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the applicable U.S. regulatory framework, primarily FCC Part 15 rules. This involves identifying all relevant technical and operational requirements for unlicensed small cell deployments. Next, they should assess proposed deployment strategies against these requirements, specifically evaluating potential interference vectors and mitigation techniques. Finally, they must implement and document compliance measures, ensuring that all deployments are validated against regulatory standards before activation. This systematic approach ensures both operational efficiency and legal adherence. Question 4. When evaluating the implementation of unlicensed small cells for enhanced mobile service in a U.S.-based service provider network, which approach best ensures compliance with regulatory requirements and minimizes the risk of harmful interference? Option A. Prioritize coverage expansion by using higher power output settings than specified in FCC Part 15, with the intention of adjusting if interference complaints are received. Option B. Conduct comprehensive pre-deployment site surveys to identify potential interference sources. Ensure the small cell technology operates within FCC Part 15 technical parameters, and establish ongoing monitoring for interference. Option C. Deploy small cells rapidly to capture market share and address coverage gaps, relying on post-deployment troubleshooting to resolve any interference issues that may arise. Option D. Assume that because the spectrum is unlicensed, regulatory oversight is minimal, and focus primarily on device certification without specific site-specific interference analysis. The correct answer is B. Conduct comprehensive pre-deployment site surveys to identify potential interference sources. Ensure the small cell technology operates within FCC Part 15 technical parameters, and establish ongoing monitoring for interference. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexities of deploying unlicensed small cells within a service provider's network. The core difficulty lies in balancing the desire for expanded coverage and capacity with the strict adherence to regulatory frameworks governing the use of unlicensed spectrum. Service providers must navigate a landscape where technological advancement meets legal and ethical obligations, ensuring that their deployments do not inadvertently cause interference or violate established rules. This requires a proactive and informed approach to compliance, rather than a reactive one. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes a thorough understanding and proactive application of the relevant regulatory framework, specifically focusing on the FCC Part 15 rules for unlicensed devices in the U.S. This involves conducting detailed site surveys to identify potential sources of interference, understanding the operational parameters of the small cell technology to ensure it operates within permitted power limits and duty cycle, and establishing robust monitoring mechanisms to detect and mitigate any interference issues that may arise post-deployment. This approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes compliance from the outset, minimizing the risk of regulatory violations, fines, and service disruption. It demonstrates a commitment to responsible spectrum utilization and customer experience, aligning with the ethical obligation to operate within legal boundaries. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves prioritizing rapid deployment and coverage expansion without a comprehensive pre-deployment interference assessment. This is a significant regulatory and ethical failure because it directly contravenes FCC Part 15 requirements that mandate unlicensed devices not cause harmful interference. Such an approach risks significant penalties, including equipment seizure and substantial fines, and can lead to service degradation for other users of the spectrum, damaging the service provider's reputation and customer trust. Another incorrect approach is to assume that because the spectrum is unlicensed, there are no significant regulatory obligations beyond basic device certification. This overlooks the crucial aspect of unlicensed, meaning no license required to operate, but not no rules to follow. FCC Part 15 imposes specific technical and operational rules designed to prevent interference. Failing to understand and adhere to these rules, such as power limits, antenna restrictions, and the requirement to accept interference from licensed services, constitutes a regulatory failure. Ethically, it demonstrates a disregard for the shared nature of the radio spectrum and the potential impact on other users. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on post-deployment troubleshooting to address interference issues. While troubleshooting is a necessary part of network management, it should not be the primary strategy for regulatory compliance. This reactive stance is a regulatory failure, as it implies a willingness to operate in a non-compliant manner until an issue is detected. It is also an ethical failure as it prioritizes expediency over the responsibility to ensure compliant operation from the moment of deployment, potentially impacting users for an extended period before a problem is identified and rectified. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a risk-based, compliance-first mindset. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the applicable regulatory framework e.g. FCC Part 15 in the U.S. 2. Integrating compliance requirements into the entire deployment lifecycle, from planning and design to deployment and operation. 3. Conducting proactive assessments e.g. site surveys, interference analysis before deployment. 4. Implementing robust monitoring and mitigation strategies. 5. Maintaining detailed documentation of compliance efforts. 6. Staying informed about evolving regulations and best practices. This systematic approach ensures that technological innovation is pursued responsibly, safeguarding both the service provider's operations and the integrity of the radio spectrum. Question 5. The performance metrics show a significant degradation in data throughput and an increase in latency for a newly deployed unlicensed small cell operating in the 5 GHz band. Initial checks indicate that the small cell is within its operational area and has a stable backhaul connection. What is the most critical first step to diagnose the performance issue, considering the regulatory framework for unlicensed spectrum? Option A. Initiate a hardware diagnostic and replacement procedure for the small cell unit. Option B. Focus troubleshooting efforts on identifying and mitigating potential interference from other Wi-Fi networks in the vicinity. Option C. Verify that the small cells transmit power and channel usage settings comply with the regulatory limits for unlicensed 5 GHz operation. Option D. Immediately increase the small cells transmit power to attempt to overcome potential signal obstructions. The correct answer is C. Verify that the small cells transmit power and channel usage settings comply with the regulatory limits for unlicensed 5 GHz operation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in deploying unlicensed small cells, ensuring compliance with regulatory spectrum usage guidelines while optimizing network performance. The challenge lies in balancing the need for robust signal coverage and capacity with the legal and technical constraints of operating within shared, unlicensed frequency bands. Misinterpreting or ignoring these regulations can lead to interference, service disruption, and potential legal repercussions, making accurate identification of the root cause critical. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic investigation that prioritizes regulatory compliance. Understanding that unlicensed spectrum is shared and subject to specific power limits and operational rules is paramount. The primary focus should be on verifying that the small cell's configuration adheres to the regulatory framework governing its operation in the specified unlicensed band. This includes checking transmit power levels, channel usage, and any mandated duty cycle limitations. By first confirming regulatory adherence, one ensures that the observed performance issues are not a direct consequence of illegal or non-compliant operation, which would be the most severe and immediate problem to address. This aligns with the principle of first, do no harm in a regulated environment. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to immediately focus solely on increasing transmit power. This is a direct violation of regulatory limits in unlicensed spectrum. Exceeding power limits can cause harmful interference to other users of the same spectrum, leading to service degradation for all and potential penalties from regulatory bodies. Another incorrect approach is to assume the issue is solely with the small cell hardware and initiate a replacement without investigating the configuration. While hardware failure is possible, it is less likely to be the root cause of performance degradation related to spectrum usage than a configuration error that violates regulatory parameters. Furthermore, focusing on external factors like Wi-Fi interference without first verifying the small cell's own compliance is premature. While external interference is a possibility, addressing potential internal regulatory noncompliance is a more fundamental and immediate step. Professional reasoning. Professionals must adopt a structured troubleshooting methodology that begins with verifying compliance with the governing regulatory framework. This involves consulting the relevant documentation for the unlicensed band being used, e.g., FCC Part 15 in the U.S. for Wi-Fi bands, and comparing the small cell's configuration against these requirements. If compliance is confirmed, then other performance-related troubleshooting steps can be pursued. This approach prioritizes legal and ethical operation, minimizes the risk of causing interference, and ensures that any subsequent performance tuning is done within the bounds of the law. Question 6. Strategic planning requires a thorough understanding of the regulatory environment governing the deployment of unlicensed small cell solutions. Considering the FCC's mandate for managing unlicensed spectrum in the United States, which of the following approaches best ensures compliance and minimizes operational risks for a service provider implementing a new small cell network? Option A. Rely exclusively on vendor certifications for equipment compliance. assuming that all equipment sold for unlicensed use adheres strictly to FCC regulations without independent verification. Option B. Prioritize rapid deployment and address any potential regulatory issues that arise post-implementation, assuming FCC Part 15 rules are generally permissive for unlicensed devices. Option C. Focus solely on the technical performance and coverage benefits of the small cell solution, deferring any detailed regulatory review until a formal FCC inquiry is initiated. Option D. Conduct comprehensive testing and validation of all small cell equipment against FCC Part 15 technical requirements and operational guidelines before and during deployment, and maintain detailed compliance documentation. The correct answer is B. Prioritize rapid deployment and address any potential regulatory issues that arise post-implementation, assuming FCC Part 15 rules are generally permissive for unlicensed devices. Explanation: the deployment of unlicensed small cells, while offering significant advantages in mobile network coverage and capacity, operates within a complex regulatory landscape. For this exam, the jurisdiction is implicitly the United States, governed by the Federal Communications Commission, FCC. The challenge lies in balancing the rapid technological advancement and deployment needs of service providers with the FCC's mandates for spectrum management, interference mitigation, and public safety. Service providers must proactively understand and adhere to FCC Part 15 rules, which govern unlicensed devices, to avoid penalties and ensure seamless network operation. The correct approach emphasizes proactive engagement with FCC regulations, specifically focusing on the technical parameters and operational guidelines for unlicensed spectrum devices. This involves thorough testing and validation of small cell equipment to ensure compliance with emission limits, power levels, and other technical requirements stipulated by the FCC. By prioritizing compliance from the outset, service providers demonstrate a commitment to responsible deployment, minimizing the risk of interference to licensed services and avoiding potential enforcement actions. This aligns with the FCC's objective of fostering innovation while protecting the integrity of the radio frequency spectrum. An incorrect approach that overlooks or downplays the importance of FCC Part 15 compliance is professionally unacceptable. This could manifest as assuming that unlicensed automatically means no regulation, leading to the deployment of equipment that exceeds permitted power levels or generates harmful interference. Such an oversight would violate FCC rules, potentially leading to significant fines, equipment seizure, and mandatory redesigns. Ethically, it represents a failure to uphold the responsibility of operating within the established legal framework, potentially impacting other spectrum users and public safety communications. Another incorrect approach might involve relying solely on vendor assurances of compliance without independent verification. While vendors play a crucial role, the ultimate responsibility for compliance rests with the service provider deploying the equipment. Failure to conduct due diligence and independent validation exposes the provider to risks if the vendor's claims are inaccurate, leading to similar regulatory and ethical failures. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the relevant regulatory framework. In this case, FCC Part 15. This involves consulting official FCC documentation, engaging with legal and regulatory experts, and incorporating compliance checks into every stage of the deployment lifecycle, from equipment selection to ongoing operation. A proactive, risk-averse strategy that prioritizes adherence to regulations over expediency is essential for sustainable and responsible deployment of unlicensed small cell solutions. Question 7. Stakeholder feedback indicates concerns regarding the potential for increased radio frequency interference and visual impact from proposed unlicensed small cell deployments in a densely populated urban residential area. Which of the following approaches best addresses these concerns while ensuring compliance with regulatory frameworks for unlicensed spectrum? Option A. Focus solely on the technical feasibility and performance metrics of the small cell technology, deferring any community engagement or impact mitigation discussions until after the initial deployment phase. Option B. Proceed with the deployment of small cells as planned, assuming that any interference or visual concerns raised by stakeholders are likely to be minor and can be addressed through post-deployment adjustments if necessary. Option C. Conduct a detailed site-specific technical analysis of potential RF interference and visual impact, Engage in proactive dialogue with community representatives and local authorities to present findings and collaboratively develop mitigation strategies, and ensure all proposed deployments adhere to the specific technical and operational guidelines for unlicensed spectrum usage. Option D. Utilize a generic, standardized impact assessment report that has been used for previous deployments in different areas, without conducting specific site surveys or engaging with the current community about their unique concerns. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed site-specific technical analysis of potential RF interference and visual impact. Engage in proactive dialogue with community representatives and local authorities to present findings and collaboratively develop mitigation strategies, and ensure all proposed deployments adhere to the specific technical and operational guidelines for unlicensed spectrum usage. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between rapid deployment of new mobile, unlicensed small cell solutions and the need for thorough impact assessment. Stakeholder feedback, particularly from residential communities, highlights potential negative externalities such as increased RF interference, visual impact, and perceived health concerns. Navigating these concerns requires a delicate balance between technological advancement and community well-being, demanding a proactive and transparent approach to impact assessment. Failure to adequately address these concerns can lead to significant deployment delays, regulatory hurdles, and damage to the service provider's reputation. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a comprehensive, multifaceted impact assessment that proactively engages with all relevant stakeholders. This includes conducting detailed technical studies to quantify potential RF interference levels and their impact on existing services and the environment, as well as performing visual impact analyses and developing mitigation strategies. Crucially, it necessitates open communication channels with community representatives, local authorities, and regulatory bodies to address concerns, explain technical aspects in an understandable manner, and collaboratively develop solutions. This approach aligns with the principles of responsible deployment, ensuring that the benefits of enhanced mobile coverage are realized without unduly burdening the community or violating regulatory guidelines for unlicensed spectrum usage. It fosters trust and facilitates smoother integration of small cell technology. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach is to prioritize rapid deployment over a thorough impact assessment, assuming that any potential negative impacts will be minor or easily resolved post-deployment. This approach is professionally unacceptable as it disregards the potential for significant interference issues that could disrupt existing services or violate regulatory limits for unlicensed spectrum. It also fails to address legitimate community concerns, leading to potential backlash, formal complaints to regulatory bodies, and ultimately, project delays or cancellations. Ethically, it demonstrates a lack of due diligence and respect for the community. Another incorrect approach is to conduct a purely technical impact assessment without considering the social and environmental aspects, such as visual aesthetics or community perception. While technical accuracy is vital, ignoring these qualitative impacts can lead to significant stakeholder opposition. This approach is professionally flawed because it fails to adopt a holistic view of the deployment's consequences. Regulatory frameworks often implicitly or explicitly require consideration of broader impacts beyond just technical compliance, and neglecting these can lead to non-compliance with broader public interest objectives. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on generic, pre-approved impact assessment templates without tailoring them to the specific deployment location and its unique characteristics. Unlicensed spectrum usage, even with small cells, can have localized effects that vary greatly depending on the density of existing infrastructure, population, and environmental factors. A one-size-fits-all approach is professionally inadequate as it may miss critical site-specific risks and fail to adequately address the specific concerns of the affected community. This can result in regulatory scrutiny and a perception of disingenuous engagement. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a proactive and iterative approach to impact assessment. This involves early and continuous engagement with all stakeholders, from technical experts and regulatory bodies to community groups and end users. The process should be data-driven, incorporating both quantitative technical analysis and qualitative social and environmental considerations. When potential negative impacts are identified, the focus should be on developing and communicating clear mitigation strategies. Transparency and a willingness to adapt deployment plans based on feedback are paramount. Professionals should always refer to the specific regulatory framework governing unlicensed spectrum usage in the relevant jurisdiction to ensure full compliance and ethical operation. Question 8. Compliance review shows that the implementation of new unlicensed small cell solutions is nearing completion, but there is uncertainty regarding the interpretation of recently updated guidelines concerning spectrum usage and interference mitigation specific to these devices. What is the most professional and compliant course of action? Option A. Prioritize completing the deployment on schedule and plan to retroactively adjust the implementation if any compliance concerns are raised by regulators post-deployment. Option B. Proceed with the deployment as planned, assuming the existing understanding of spectrum usage and interference mitigation is sufficient, and address any potential issues if they arise later. Option C. Immediately seek official clarification from the relevant regulatory authority regarding the specific interpretation of the updated guidelines for unlicensed small cell deployments. Option D. Rely solely on the company's internal legal team's interpretation of the updated guidelines and proceed with the deployment without further external consultation. The correct answer is C. Immediately seek official clarification from the relevant regulatory authority regarding the specific interpretation of the updated guidelines for unlicensed small cell deployments. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge stemming from the need to balance rapid deployment of unlicensed small cell solutions with adherence to evolving regulatory requirements. The core difficulty lies in interpreting and applying potentially ambiguous or newly introduced regulatory guidelines to a practical implementation, especially when stakeholder expectations for speed are high. The pressure to deploy quickly can create a temptation to overlook or downplay compliance nuances, leading to potential legal and operational repercussions. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves proactively engaging with the relevant regulatory bodies to seek clarification on the specific requirements for unlicensed small cell deployments. This demonstrates a commitment to compliance and a thorough understanding of the regulatory landscape. By seeking official guidance, the organization mitigates the risk of misinterpretation and ensures that the deployment aligns with the spirit and letter of the law. This proactive stance is best professional practice as it prioritizes legal and ethical operation, safeguarding the company from penalties and reputational damage, and fostering a trustworthy relationship with regulators. It aligns with the principle of due diligence in implementing new technologies within a regulated environment. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves proceeding with deployment based on a general understanding of previous regulations, assuming that minor changes will not significantly impact the current implementation. This is professionally unacceptable as it disregards the specific, potentially updated, requirements for unlicensed small cell solutions. Regulatory frameworks are dynamic, and relying on outdated knowledge can lead to non-compliance, resulting in fines, forced removal of equipment, or other sanctions. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize speed of deployment over thorough regulatory review, assuming that any compliance issues can be addressed retroactively. This is ethically and legally flawed. Retroactive compliance is often more costly and complex than proactive adherence. It demonstrates a lack of respect for the regulatory process and can be interpreted as a deliberate attempt to circumvent rules, leading to severe penalties and a damaged corporate reputation. A further incorrect approach is to rely solely on internal legal counsel's interpretation without seeking direct clarification from the regulatory authority, especially if the guidelines are new or complex. While internal counsel is valuable, direct engagement with the regulator ensures the most accurate and authoritative understanding of their expectations for unlicensed small cell deployments. Failure to do so risks misinterpretation and subsequent noncompliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing such situations should adopt a structured decision-making process. First, identify the specific regulatory framework applicable to unlicensed small cell solutions in the relevant jurisdiction. Second, thoroughly review all available documentation and guidelines from the regulatory body. Third, if any ambiguity or uncertainty exists, proactively engage with the regulatory authority through official channels to seek clarification. Fourth, Document all communications and decisions related to compliance. Finally, ensure that all deployment plans and executed implementations strictly adhere to the confirmed regulatory requirements. This systematic approach ensures that business objectives are met responsibly and ethically. Question 9. Process analysis reveals that a service provider is planning a large-scale deployment of unlicensed small cells to enhance mobile coverage in a dense urban environment. The primary concern is ensuring that these small cells operate within the regulatory framework governing unlicensed spectrum to avoid interference and legal repercussions. Which of the following strategies best ensures compliance with the operational requirements for unlicensed spectrum usage in this scenario? Option A. Prioritizing rapid deployment and cost-effectiveness by using readily available unlicensed small cell hardware, with the intention of addressing any potential regulatory issues only if they arise. Option B. Implementing a comprehensive strategy that includes verifying equipment compliance with specific regional unlicensed spectrum regulations, configuring devices to adhere to power limits and channel restrictions, and establishing monitoring for interference. Option C. Relying solely on the equipment vendor's assurance that the small cells are compliant with all relevant standards, without conducting independent verification or understanding the specific operational context. Option D. Deploying small cells with the highest possible transmit power to maximize coverage and capacity, assuming that as long as the equipment is certified, it meets all regulatory needs. The correct answer is D. Deploying small cells with the highest possible transmit power to maximize coverage and capacity, assuming that as long as the equipment is certified, it meets all regulatory needs. Explanation. Scenario analysis. Deploying unlicensed small cells in a service provider context presents a significant challenge due to the inherent complexities of operating within shared, unlicensed spectrum. The primary professional challenge lies in ensuring compliance with the regulatory framework governing the use of this spectrum, which is designed to prevent interference and ensure fair access for all users. Failure to adhere to these regulations can lead to service disruptions, legal penalties, and reputational damage. Careful judgment is required to balance the benefits of increased network capacity and coverage offered by small cells with the strict obligations imposed by regulatory bodies. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a proactive and thorough understanding of the specific regulatory requirements for unlicensed spectrum operation within the relevant jurisdiction. This includes, but is not limited to, adhering to power limits, channel usage restrictions, and any mandatory registration or reporting obligations. For unlicensed small cells, this often translates to implementing mechanisms that ensure the device operates within defined power spectral density, PSD, limits and avoids causing harmful interference to licensed services or other unlicensed devices. Best professional practice dictates that the deployment strategy must prioritize regulatory compliance from the design phase through to ongoing operation. This ensures the service provider acts responsibly, maintains the integrity of the radio spectrum, and avoids potential enforcement actions. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that because the spectrum is unlicensed, there are no significant regulatory constraints beyond basic equipment certification. This overlooks the detailed operational rules designed to manage shared spectrum effectively. Such an assumption can lead to deployments that exceed power limits or utilize restricted channels, directly violating regulations and causing interference. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize rapid deployment and cost-saving measures over rigorous compliance checks. This might involve using off-the-shelf equipment without verifying its adherence to specific regional unlicensed spectrum rules, or neglecting to implement dynamic frequency selection, DFS, or transmit power control, TPC, mechanisms where mandated. This approach is professionally unacceptable as it demonstrates a disregard for the legal and ethical obligations associated with spectrum usage, potentially leading to significant penalties and service degradation for others. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on the equipment manufacturer's claims of compliance without independent verification or understanding the specific operational context. Manufacturers may certify equipment for general use, but the service provider is ultimately responsible for ensuring that the deployment within their network adheres to all applicable regulations, which can be nuanced and context-dependent. Professional reasoning. professionals tasked with implementing unlicensed small cell solutions must adopt a risk-based approach to regulatory compliance. This involves 1. Thoroughly researching and understanding the specific regulations for unlicensed spectrum in the target deployment region. This includes consulting official documentation from the relevant regulatory authority. 2. Incorporating compliance requirements into the design and selection of small cell hardware and software. This means choosing equipment that is certified for the intended use and can be configured to meet all operational parameters. 3. Implementing robust monitoring and management systems to ensure ongoing compliance. This includes verifying that small cells are operating within power limits, avoiding interference, and adhering to any dynamic spectrum access requirements. 4. Establishing clear internal policies and training for personnel involved in deployment and operation to reinforce the importance of regulatory adherence. 5. Maintaining open communication with regulatory bodies and staying informed about any changes or updates to the regulatory landscape. Question 10. The monitoring system demonstrates a consistent, albeit low-level, increase in detected noise floor readings within the 5 GHz unlicensed band for a specific small cell deployment. This increase is not currently impacting user experience data rates or call quality, but it deviates from the historical baseline performance for that cell. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action to address this observation? Option A. Immediately reduce the transmit power of the affected small cell to mitigate any potential contribution to spectrum congestion. Option B. Log the observation as a minor fluctuation and continue monitoring without further investigation, assuming it will self-resolve. Option C. Reconfigure the small cell's channel selection to a less congested channel within the 5 GHz band without performing any environmental analysis. Option D. Initiate a detailed spectrum analysis of the surrounding environment and correlate findings with known Wi-Fi deployments and potential sources of interference in the vicinity. The correct answer is D. Initiate a detailed spectrum analysis of the surrounding environment and correlate findings with known Wi-Fi deployments and potential sources of interference in the vicinity. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the dynamic nature of unlicensed spectrum usage and the potential for interference. The monitoring system's alert signifies a deviation from expected performance, requiring a swift and accurate diagnosis to maintain service quality and adhere to regulatory guidelines. The core challenge lies in distinguishing between legitimate spectrum fluctuations and actual, reportable interference events that could necessitate intervention or escalation. Misinterpreting the data could lead to unnecessary service disruptions, wasted resources, or, conversely, failure to address a genuine regulatory breach. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic investigation that prioritizes data correlation and contextual understanding. This aligns with best professional practice by employing a data-driven methodology to identify the root cause of the observed anomaly, specifically correlating the monitoring system's alert with other network performance indicators, e.g., signal strength, data throughput, latency, and cross-referencing with known environmental factors or scheduled events, e.g., nearby Wi-Fi deployments, public events, allows for a nuanced assessment. This approach is professionally sound because it adheres to the principles of responsible spectrum management, which is paramount in unlicensed bands. It ensures that any action taken is based on verified data, minimizing the risk of false positives, and maintaining compliance with the spirit and letter of regulatory frameworks governing unlicensed spectrum use, such as those overseen by the FCC in the United States. This methodical investigation prevents hasty decisions that could negatively impact service or lead to regulatory scrutiny. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately escalating the alert for potential interference without further investigation. This is professionally unacceptable because it bypasses critical diagnostic steps. It represents a failure to apply due diligence and could lead to unnecessary alarm and resource allocation for a non-existent problem. Ethically and regulatorily, it demonstrates a lack of responsibility in managing spectrum resources and could erode confidence in the network's operational integrity. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the alert as a transient anomaly without attempting to gather supporting data or context. This is professionally unsound, as it ignores a potential indicator of service degradation or a developing interference issue. It fails to uphold the professional obligation to ensure reliable service delivery and could lead to prolonged periods of suboptimal performance or undetected interference, potentially violating service-level agreements and regulatory expectations for network stability. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on the small cell's configuration settings as the sole cause of the alert, without considering external factors. While configuration can play a role, unlicensed spectrum is inherently susceptible to external interference. This approach is professionally deficient because it adopts a narrow perspective, neglecting the broader operational environment. It fails to acknowledge the shared nature of unlicensed spectrum and the need for comprehensive troubleshooting that considers all potential contributing factors, including those outside the direct control of the small cell itself. This can lead to misdiagnosis and ineffective remediation, ultimately impacting service quality and potentially leading to regulatory noncompliance if interference is not properly addressed. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured troubleshooting methodology. This begins with acknowledging the alert and its potential implications. The next step is to gather all available data, both from the monitoring system and other relevant network elements. This data should then be analyzed in context, considering environmental factors and known operational events. Based on this analysis, a hypothesis should be formed about the root cause. If the hypothesis points to a genuine interference issue, then appropriate escalation and remediation steps, in line with regulatory guidelines, should be initiated. If the anomaly is determined to be transient or attributable to non-interfering factors, documentation of the investigation and resolution is crucial for future reference and continuous improvement. This systematic, data-driven, and context-aware approach ensures efficient problem-solving, regulatory compliance, and the delivery of reliable service. Question 11. System analysis indicates that a service provider is planning a significant rollout of unlicensed small cells to enhance mobile coverage in a dense urban area. The primary technical objective is to maximize signal strength and reach. Given the critical importance of regulatory adherence in unlicensed spectrum operations, what is the most prudent approach to ensure compliance and operational success? Option A. Prioritize deploying small cells with the highest possible power output within the unlicensed bands to achieve maximum coverage, assuming that minor deviations will not cause significant interference. Option B. Rely on the default power settings provided by the small cell vendor, as these are typically designed to be broadly compliant across various regions. Option C. Deploy the small cells with a moderate power setting, assuming that this will strike a balance between coverage and interference, without needing to consult specific regulatory documentation. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of the specific regulatory framework governing the unlicensed spectrum bands to be used, focusing on defined IEP limits, channel access mechanisms, and any regional operational guidelines, and ensure all deployed equipment strictly adheres to these parameters. Correct answer is A. Prioritize deploying small cells with the highest possible power output within the unlicensed band to achieve maximum coverage, assuming that minor deviations will not cause significant interference. Explanation. Scenario analysis. Deploying unlicensed small cells in a service provider context presents a complex challenge due to the shared nature of the radio spectrum. Ensuring effective and interference-free operation requires a deep understanding of regulatory compliance, particularly concerning power limits and channel usage. The professional challenge lies in balancing the desire for increased network capacity and coverage with the absolute necessity of adhering to the governing regulatory framework to avoid service disruption, legal penalties, and damage to the provider's reputation. Misinterpreting or overlooking specific regulatory requirements can lead to significant operational issues and noncompliance. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the relevant regulatory framework, specifically focusing on the technical parameters for unlicensed spectrum operation. This includes understanding the maximum effective isotropic radiated power IEP limits, channel access mechanisms, like listen before talk or LBT, and any specific regional restrictions or guidelines for small cell deployments. Adhering strictly to these defined parameters is paramount for ensuring legal operation and minimizing interference with other users of the unlicensed spectrum. This proactive, compliance-first methodology represents best professional practice as it directly addresses the core regulatory obligations and mitigates potential risks before deployment. It demonstrates a commitment to responsible spectrum utilization and operational integrity. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach is to assume that because the spectrum is unlicensed, there are no significant regulatory constraints on power output or operational behavior. This fails to recognize that unlicensed spectrum still operates under specific rules designed to prevent harmful interference. The regulatory framework, even for unlicensed bands, dictates power limits and operational procedures to ensure fair access and coexistence. Violating these limits can lead to equipment being deemed non-compliant, potential fines, and mandatory cessation of service. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize deployment speed and perceived network performance over a detailed understanding of the regulatory limits. This might involve deploying small cells with power settings that are slightly above the allowed IO, believing the impact will be negligible. This is a critical regulatory failure because it directly contravenes the established power limits, increasing the risk of interference and non-compliance. Ethically, it also undermines the principle of responsible spectrum sharing. A third incorrect approach is to rely solely on vendor default configurations without independent verification against the specific regulatory requirements of the deployment region. While vendors aim for compliance, regional variations and specific deployment scenarios might necessitate adjustments. Failing to verify can lead to deploying equipment that, while compliant in one region, is not in another, leading to regulatory violations. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic, compliance-driven approach. This begins with identifying the specific unlicensed frequency bands intended for deployment, and then meticulously researching and understanding the governing regulatory body's rules for those bands. This includes obtaining and reviewing official documentation on power limits, IO, antenna gain restrictions, duty cycle limitations, and any required channel access protocols. A checklist should be developed based on these regulations, and each small cell deployment must be validated against this checklist before activation. Regular audits and updates to this process are also essential as regulations can evolve. This structured methodology ensures that all deployments are not only technically sound, but also fully compliant, safeguarding the service provider from legal repercussions and ensuring harmonious operation within the shared spectrum environment. Question 12. Quality control measures reveal that a newly deployed unlicensed small cell in a dense urban environment is intermittently experiencing performance degradation, potentially due to interference. The engineering team is considering adjusting the transmit power levels to improve signal quality. Which of the following actions best represents a compliant and professional approach to resolving this issue, considering the regulatory framework for unlicensed spectrum usage? Option A. Consult the relevant regulatory body's technical specifications for unlicensed spectrum usage, verify the current transmit power settings against these limits, and adjust the power only within the permitted range, potentially exploring other interference mitigation techniques if necessary. Option B. Immediately reduce the transmit power of the small cell to the minimum acceptable level to avoid any potential for interference, even if it impacts coverage and capacity. Option C. Assume the performance degradation is due to external factors unrelated to the small cell's transmission, and continue monitoring without making any configuration changes to avoid disrupting the current operational state. Option D. Increase the transmit power of the small cell to overcome any perceived interference and improve signal strength, as the unlicensed spectrum is intended for flexible use. Correct answer is D. Increase the transmit power of the small cell to overcome any perceived interference and improve signal strength, as the unlicensed spectrum is intended for flexible use. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in deploying unlicensed small cells, ensuring compliance with spectrum usage regulations while optimizing network performance. The professional challenge lies in balancing the desire for increased capacity and coverage with the legal and technical obligations to avoid harmful interference. Misinterpreting or disregarding these regulations can lead to significant penalties, service disruptions for other users, and damage to the service provider's reputation. The correct approach prioritizes adherence to the regulatory framework governing unlicensed spectrum. This involves understanding the specific technical parameters and operational constraints defined by the relevant regulatory body for unlicensed bands. By proactively verifying that the small cell deployment adheres to these limits, the service provider demonstrates due diligence and upholds its responsibility to the broader spectrum ecosystem. This aligns with the core principles of responsible spectrum management and regulatory compliance, which are paramount in the telecommunications industry. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on maximizing signal strength without considering regulatory limits fails to acknowledge the legal framework. This could lead to exceeding power limits or employing transmission techniques that cause interference to other licensed or unlicensed services operating in adjacent or shared bands. Such actions are a direct violation of regulatory mandates and can result in fines, equipment seizure, and mandatory service cessation. Another incorrect approach that overlooks the need for dynamic power control or interference mitigation mechanisms, assuming static compliance is sufficient, is also professionally unsound. Unlicensed spectrum is dynamic, and interference conditions can change. Failing to implement adaptive measures means the deployment might inadvertently cause interference under certain environmental conditions, even if initially compliant. This demonstrates a lack of foresight and a failure to implement robust, future-proof solutions. The professional decision-making process for such situations should involve a thorough understanding of the applicable regulatory framework from the outset of the deployment planning phase. This includes consulting official documentation from the regulatory authority, engaging with legal and compliance teams, and ensuring that network design and configuration tools are set to enforce these limits. When issues arise, the process should involve immediate investigation against the regulatory requirements, followed by corrective actions that bring the deployment back into compliance, rather than attempting to justify noncompliance. Question 13. Cost-benefit analysis shows that deploying a large number of unlicensed small cells across a metropolitan area could significantly improve mobile network coverage and capacity. However, the chosen small cell hardware, while cost-effective, has been identified as potentially lacking robust dynamic frequency selection (DFS) capabilities and advanced transmit power control (TPC) features that are critical for operating within the specified unlicensed bands without causing interference to other services. What is the most professionally responsible approach to proceed with this deployment? Option A. Deploy the hardware but implement a manual monitoring system to detect potential interference and adjust power levels on a case-by-case basis, relying on the hope that regulatory bodies will not discover the noncompliance. Option B. Deploy the hardware and submit a waiver request to the regulatory authority, explaining the cost benefits and proposing a limited monitoring plan, while proceeding with the deployment pending approval. Option C. Proceed with the deployment using the selected hardware, assuming that the probability of causing interference is low and that any potential issues can be addressed reactively if they arise. Option D. Immediately halt the deployment and source alternative small cell hardware that explicitly meets or exceeds all regulatory requirements for unlicensed spectrum operation, including advanced DFS and TPC, even if it incurs higher upfront costs. The correct answer is C. Proceed with the deployment using the selected hardware, assuming that the probability of causing interference is low and that any potential issues can be addressed reactively if they arise. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common implementation challenge in service provider mobile unlicensed small cell deployments, balancing the need for rapid network expansion with strict adherence to regulatory compliance, specifically concerning spectrum usage and interference mitigation. The professional challenge lies in identifying and implementing solutions that are not only technically effective, but also legally sound and ethically responsible, ensuring the service provider operates within the bounds of the law and avoids negative impacts on other spectrum users. The pressure to deploy quickly can sometimes lead to overlooking critical regulatory details, making careful judgment and a thorough understanding of the applicable framework paramount. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive strategy that prioritizes regulatory compliance from the outset. This means thoroughly investigating and implementing solutions that inherently meet or exceed the requirements of the relevant regulatory body for unlicensed spectrum operation. This includes employing technologies that offer robust interference detection and mitigation capabilities, such as dynamic frequency selection, DFS, and transmit power control, TPC mechanisms, as mandated by the regulatory framework. By choosing equipment and deployment strategies that are designed with these regulatory mandates in mind, the service provider ensures that their small cell deployment is not only functional but also legally permissible, and minimizes the risk of interference complaints or regulatory penalties. This approach represents best professional practice because it aligns with the legal obligations of spectrum usage, demonstrates corporate responsibility, and safeguards the long-term viability of the network by avoiding potential disruptions and legal entanglements. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves prioritizing cost savings by selecting the least expensive small cell hardware without adequately verifying its compliance with all applicable unlicensed spectrum regulations. This can lead to significant regulatory and ethical failures. The hardware might lack essential features like DFS or TPC, or its implementation of these features might be substandard, leading to interference with licensed services or other unlicensed users. This directly violates the spirit and letter of regulations designed to ensure fair and efficient use of the radio spectrum. Ethically, it is irresponsible to deploy technology that could disrupt critical services or negatively impact other users. Another incorrect approach is to assume that standard Wi-Fi equipment is automatically compliant with all service provider small cell deployment regulations for unlicensed spectrum. While Wi-Fi operates in unlicensed bands, the specific requirements for service provider deployments, especially concerning power levels, channel usage, and interference management, can be more stringent. Relying on this assumption without explicit verification can result in non-compliance, leading to regulatory fines and the need for costly retrofits or replacements. This demonstrates a failure to conduct due diligence and a lack of understanding of the specific regulatory nuances applicable to the deployment context. A third incorrect approach is to delay or neglect the formal regulatory approval process for unlicensed small cell deployments, hoping that the deployment will go unnoticed or that minor issues can be addressed later. This is a direct violation of regulatory requirements that often mandate pre-deployment notification or approval for certain types of radio equipment. Such a delay or omission creates significant legal and ethical risks, including potential shutdown orders, substantial fines, and damage to the service provider's reputation. It shows a disregard for the established legal framework governing spectrum use. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a risk-aware and compliance-first mindset. The decision-making process should begin with a thorough understanding of the specific regulatory framework governing unlicensed spectrum use in the target deployment region. This involves consulting official documentation from the relevant regulatory authority, engaging with legal and compliance teams, and selecting equipment and deployment strategies that demonstrably meet these requirements. A robust due diligence process, including vendor verification and technical validation of compliance features, is essential. When faced with cost pressures, professionals should advocate for solutions that balance economic viability with regulatory adherence, recognizing that non-compliance carries far greater long-term costs. Prioritizing proactive compliance over reactive remediation is a hallmark of professional responsibility in this domain. Question 14. The performance metrics show a consistent increase in packet loss and a decrease in throughput for a specific sector served by multiple unlicensed small cells, coinciding with periods of peak user activity on those small cells. Option A. Immediately reduce the transmit power of all small cells in the network by a fixed percentage to mitigate potential interference. Option B. Initiate a detailed analysis of the small cell transmissions in the affected sector, focusing on channel utilization, power levels, and potential co-channel or adjacent channel interference, and implement adaptive power control and channel selection adjustments based on findings. Option C. Assume the performance degradation is due to external factors unrelated to the small cell deployment and continue monitoring without intervention. Option D. Attribute the performance issues solely to the licensed spectrum user in the adjacent band and escalate a complaint to the regulatory authority. The correct answer is B. Initiate a detailed analysis of the small cell transmissions in the affected sector, focusing on channel utilization, power levels, and potential co-channel or adjacent channel interference, and implement adaptive power control and channel selection adjustments based on findings. Explanation. Scenario analysis. The scenario presents a common challenge in deploying unlicensed small cells. The The potential for interference with existing licensed spectrum users. This is professionally challenging because it directly impacts service quality for both the small cell deployment and potentially other wireless services. The need to balance the benefits of unlicensed spectrum, cost-effectiveness, rapid deployment, with the regulatory obligation to avoid harmful interference, requires careful technical judgment and adherence to specific operational guidelines. The core challenge lies in proactively identifying and mitigating interference before it escalates into a service disruption or regulatory complaint. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a proactive and data-driven strategy. By analyzing performance metrics that indicate potential interference, e.g., increased error rates, reduced throughput, dropped connections specifically correlated with small cell activity, the operator demonstrates a commitment to responsible spectrum usage. This aligns with the fundamental regulatory principle of operate and be liable common in spectrum management, where the onus is on the licensee or operator to ensure their transmissions do not cause harmful interference. Implementing adaptive power control and channel selection mechanisms based on real-time spectrum analysis is a best professional practice because it directly addresses the root cause of interference, ensuring compliance with any implicit or explicit operational parameters for unlicensed bands, and maintaining the integrity of the overall wireless ecosystem. This approach prioritizes service quality and regulatory adherence through technical means. Incorrect approaches analysis. Ignoring performance metrics that suggest interference is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the potential impact on other users. This can lead to complaints from other spectrum users, regulatory investigations, and potential penalties. It also violates the principle of responsible spectrum stewardship. Attributing performance degradation solely to external factors without investigating the small cell's contribution is another failure. This approach avoids accountability and prevents the implementation of necessary corrective actions. It is ethically questionable as it misrepresents the operational status and potential causes of service issues. Implementing a blanket power reduction across all small cells without specific analysis is inefficient and may unnecessarily degrade the intended service coverage of the small cells. While it might reduce interference, it fails to address the specific source and could be a suboptimal technical solution, indicating a lack of deep analytical understanding of the problem. This approach is less about proactive mitigation and more about a broad, potentially ineffective, response. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a systematic approach to performance monitoring and interference management. This involves 1. Establishing baseline performance metrics for both the small cell network and potentially surrounding licensed services. 2. Continuously monitoring key performance indicators, KPI, for anomalies. 3. Correlating observed anomalies with the operational status and activity of the small cell network. 4. Employing advanced diagnostic tools to pinpoint the source and nature of interference. 5. Implementing targeted mitigation strategies such as adaptive power control, channel adjustments, or antenna reorientation based on the analysis. 6. Documenting all findings, actions, and their outcomes for audit and continuous improvement. This structured process ensures that decisions are data-driven, technically sound, and compliant with regulatory expectations for responsible wireless operations. Question 15. Stakeholder feedback indicates a desire to rapidly deploy Cisco unlicensed small cell solutions to enhance mobile coverage in a dense urban environment. The service provider is considering a strategy that prioritizes speed of deployment over a comprehensive review of specific local regulatory requirements for unlicensed spectrum usage, assuming that unlicensed implies minimal regulatory constraints. Which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory compliance for implementing these small cell solutions? Option A. Focus solely on the technical performance and coverage benefits of the small cells, deferring any regulatory compliance checks until after the network has been fully operational for a significant period. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of all applicable national and local regulations pertaining to unlicensed spectrum usage, including power output limits, antenna specifications, and interference mitigation techniques, before commencing any deployment. Option C. Proceed with the deployment of small cells immediately, relying on the inherent nature of unlicensed spectrum to avoid regulatory issues, and address any potential compliance concerns reactively if they arise. Option D. Deploy small cells with standard configurations, assuming that these configurations are pre-approved for all unlicensed spectrum deployments regardless of geographic location or specific regulatory nuances. The correct answer is B. Conduct a thorough review of all applicable national and local regulations pertaining to unlicensed spectrum usage, including power output limits, antenna specifications, and interference mitigation techniques, before commencing any deployment. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent tension between rapid deployment of new mobile technologies and the strict adherence to regulatory frameworks designed to protect public interest and ensure fair spectrum utilization. The service provider must balance the desire to leverage unlicensed spectrum for small cell solutions to improve network coverage and capacity with the legal obligations and technical requirements mandated by regulatory bodies. Failure to do so can result in significant penalties, reputational damage, and operational disruptions. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a proactive and thorough understanding of the specific regulatory requirements for unlicensed small cell deployments within the relevant jurisdiction. This involves engaging with regulatory bodies, conducting detailed site surveys to ensure compliance with power limits and interference mitigation techniques, and implementing robust monitoring systems. This diligent approach ensures that the deployment not only meets technical objectives, but also operates within legal boundaries, minimizing the risk of interference with licensed services and adhering to public safety guidelines. This aligns with the ethical responsibility of a service provider to operate in a manner that is both beneficial to its customers and respectful of the established regulatory environment. An incorrect approach that involves deploying small cells without verifying compliance with local power output regulations is professionally unacceptable. This failure directly violates the core principles of spectrum management, which aim to prevent harmful interference. Such an action could lead to disruptions for other spectrum users, including critical public safety communications or licensed mobile operators, resulting in regulatory fines and potential legal action. Another incorrect approach, deploying small cells without consulting the relevant regulatory framework for antenna height and placement restrictions, is also professionally unacceptable. This oversight can lead to signal propagation issues, unintended interference with other services, and potential violations of local zoning ordinances or aviation safety regulations. The ethical failure lies in disregarding established rules designed for public safety and orderly spectrum use. A third incorrect approach, assuming that unlicensed spectrum inherently means no regulatory oversight for small cell deployments, demonstrates a fundamental misunderstanding of the regulatory landscape. Unlicensed spectrum, while not requiring individual licenses for each device, is still subject to specific rules regarding power levels, emission masks, and operational parameters to prevent interference. This assumption leads to non-compliance and potential penalties. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a multi-step approach. First, identify the specific regulatory jurisdiction governing the deployment. Second, thoroughly research and understand all applicable regulations pertaining to unlicensed spectrum use, small cell technology, power limits, antenna characteristics, and interference mitigation. Third, consult with legal and regulatory experts to interpret complex requirements. Fourth, conduct pre-deployment assessments including site surveys and technical evaluations to confirm compliance. Fifth, implement ongoing monitoring and reporting mechanisms to ensure continued adherence to regulations. Finally, maintain open communication channels with regulatory bodies. Question 16. Process analysis reveals that a service provider is planning a rapid rollout of unlicensed small cell solution across multiple urban areas to enhance mobile network capacity. The project team is under significant pressure to meet aggressive deployment timelines. Given the dynamic nature of unlicensed spectrum regulations and the potential for interference, which of the following approaches best ensures compliance and minimizes operational risks? Option A. Deploy the small cells as quickly as possible to gain a competitive advantage, and address any potential regulatory compliance issues or interference complaints only if they are formally raised by regulatory authorities or affected parties. Option B. Assume that commercially available small cell equipment, certified for general use, will automatically meet all regulatory requirements for unlicensed spectrum in the target jurisdiction and proceed with deployment based on vendor specifications. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive review of the specific national regulatory framework governing unlicensed spectrum usage for small cells, including power limits, channel restrictions, and interference mitigation requirements, and integrate these findings into the deployment plan and equipment selection criteria. Option D. Rely solely on the equipment vendor's claims of compliance without independent verification, and defer any detailed regulatory analysis until after the initial deployment phase is complete. The correct answer is C. Conduct a comprehensive review of the specific national regulatory framework governing unlicensed spectrum usage for small cells, including power limits, channel restrictions, and interference mitigation requirements, and integrate these findings into the deployment plan and equipment selection criteria. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge stemming from the inherent tension between rapid deployment of new mobile, unlicensed small cell solutions and the need to adhere to evolving regulatory frameworks. The pressure to innovate and capture market share can lead stakeholders to overlook or misinterpret compliance requirements, particularly concerning spectrum usage and interference mitigation. The complexity of unlicensed spectrum, shared by various devices and services, necessitates a proactive and thorough understanding of the applicable regulations to avoid legal repercussions and service disruption. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach emphasizes proactive engagement with regulatory bodies and a thorough understanding of the specific technical and operational requirements stipulated by the relevant authorities for unlicensed small cell deployments. This involves not only understanding the technical specifications of the small cell equipment, but also the operational guidelines for deployment, including power limits, channel selection, and interference reporting mechanisms. Adhering to these guidelines ensures that the deployment is compliant with the regulatory framework, thereby minimizing the risk of penalties, service interruptions, and damage to the service provider's reputation. This approach reflects best professional practice by prioritizing legal and ethical compliance, ensuring the long-term viability and trustworthiness of the service. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves prioritizing speed of deployment over comprehensive regulatory review, assuming that standard off-the-shelf equipment will automatically meet all compliance needs. This is a significant regulatory failure, as it demonstrates a lack of due diligence in verifying compliance with specific national regulations governing unlicensed spectrum usage, which can vary significantly. Such an assumption can lead to unintentional violations of power limits or channel restrictions, causing interference to other licensed or unlicensed services, and resulting in fines or forced equipment deactivation. Another incorrect approach is to rely solely on vendor assurances of compliance without independent verification or understanding of the underlying regulatory principles. While vendors are responsible for manufacturing compliant equipment, the responsibility for ensuring that the deployment and operation of that equipment adheres to local regulations rests with the service provider. This approach represents an ethical failure by abdicating responsibility for compliance and a regulatory failure by not independently validating that the deployed solution meets the specific requirements of the jurisdiction. A third incorrect approach is to adopt a wait-and-see attitude, deploying the small cells and addressing any potential regulatory issues only if they arise. This is a highly risky and unprofessional strategy. It demonstrates a disregard for regulatory obligations and a failure to proactively manage risk. If regulatory issues do arise, the consequences can be severe, including significant fines, mandatory network shutdowns, and legal action, far outweighing the cost of proactive compliance. This approach is ethically unsound as it prioritizes short-term gains over responsible operation and legal adherence. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this domain should adopt a risk-based approach to regulatory compliance. This involves identifying all applicable regulations for unlicensed spectrum usage in the target jurisdiction, understanding the technical and operational requirements, and integrating compliance checks into the entire lifecycle of the small cell deployment, from planning and procurement to operation and decommissioning. Regular audits and updates on regulatory changes are crucial. When faced with deployment pressures, professionals must advocate for sufficient time and resources to ensure thorough compliance, rather than compromising on legal and ethical standards. The decision-making process should always prioritize long-term sustainability and reputation over short-term expediency. Question 17. Operational review demonstrates that a new unlicensed small cell deployment is being considered for a dense urban area with significant existing Wi-Fi activity. The proposed deployment aims to enhance mobile coverage and capacity. What is the most critical step to ensure compliance with the regulatory framework for unlicensed spectrum use before proceeding with the deployment? Option A. Prioritize the deployment based on the projected increase in mobile data traffic, assuming that any potential interference will be minor and manageable through future software updates. Option B. Rely on the small cell manufacturer's default configuration settings, assuming they are pre-approved for all operational environments and regulatory jurisdictions. Option C. Deploy the small cell immediately to gain a competitive advantage and address any regulatory concerns that may arise after the service is operational. Option D. Conduct a thorough interference assessment to identify potential conflicts with existing licensed and unlicensed services operating in the same frequency bands, and verify that the small cell's transmission parameters, e.g., power levels, channel selection, adhere strictly to the limits defined by the relevant regulatory body. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough interference assessment to identify potential conflicts with existing licensed and unlicensed services operating in the same frequency bands, and verify that the small cell's transmission parameters, e.g., power levels, channel selection, adhere strictly to the limits defined by the relevant regulatory body. Explanation. The scenario presents a common challenge in deploying unlicensed small cells, ensuring compliance with evolving regulatory frameworks while maintaining service quality and operational efficiency. The professional challenge lies in balancing the rapid pace of technological deployment with the need for thorough impact assessments that consider potential interference, spectrum availability, and adherence to the specific regulations governing unlicensed spectrum use in the relevant jurisdiction. A hasty deployment without proper assessment risks regulatory penalties, service disruption, and damage to the service provider's reputation. The correct approach involves a proactive and comprehensive impact assessment that meticulously evaluates potential interference with existing licensed services and other unlicensed devices. This includes understanding the specific technical parameters and operational guidelines mandated by the regulatory body for unlicensed small cell deployments. By conducting this assessment prior to deployment, the service provider can identify and mitigate potential issues, ensuring adherence to the regulatory framework and minimizing the risk of service disruption or complaints. This aligns with the principle of responsible spectrum utilization and demonstrates due diligence in complying with the law. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with deployment based on assumptions or incomplete data regarding spectrum usage and potential interference. This could lead to violations of regulations designed to protect licensed services from harmful interference. For instance, deploying a small cell without verifying its power output or channel selection against regulatory limits could result in exceeding permitted levels, causing interference and incurring penalties. Another incorrect approach might be to solely focus on the technical performance of the small cell without considering its broader impact on the unlicensed spectrum environment, potentially leading to congestion and degraded service for all users in that band. Ethically, this demonstrates a disregard for the shared nature of the spectrum and the regulatory obligations to avoid causing harm to other users. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that prioritizes regulatory compliance and responsible spectrum management. This involves establishing clear protocols for impact assessments, including pre-deployment spectrum analysis, interference modeling, and verification against specific regulatory requirements. When faced with potential conflicts or uncertainties, seeking clarification from the regulatory authority or consulting with spectrum management experts is crucial. The decision to deploy should only be made after a thorough assessment confirms that the proposed deployment will operate within all applicable legal and technical parameters, thereby safeguarding both the service provider's operations and the integrity of the shared spectrum. Question 18. Assessment of the regulatory compliance strategy for implementing Cisco unlicensed small cell solutions in a densely populated urban environment, considering the potential for interference with existing licensed spectrum users. Option A. Deploy the small cells using the highest possible transmit power to maximize coverage and capacity, assuming that any interference issues will be resolved through negotiation with affected parties. Option B. Conduct a thorough review of the specific regulatory framework governing unlicensed spectrum use in the deployment jurisdiction, including power limits, emission masks, and operational restrictions, and implement a rigorous pre-deployment testing and validation process to ensure all small cell units strictly adhere to these requirements. Option C. Focus solely on the technical performance metrics of the small cells, such as throughput and latency, and address any interference complaints reactively as they arise. Option D. Prioritize deployment speed and capacity gains by assuming vendor compliance with all applicable unlicensed spectrum regulations and conducting minimal post-deployment interference checks. The correct answer is D. Prioritize deployment speed and capacity gains by assuming vendor compliance with all applicable unlicensed spectrum regulations and conducting minimal post-deployment interference checks. Explanation: the deployment of unlicensed small cells in a service provider context introduces significant regulatory compliance challenges, particularly concerning spectrum usage and interference mitigation. The scenario is professionally challenging because service providers must balance the benefits of increased capacity and coverage offered by unlicensed bands with the strict legal obligations to avoid causing harmful interference to licensed services operating in adjacent or shared spectrum. Failure to adhere to these regulations can result in substantial fines, service disruption, and reputational damage. The correct approach involves a proactive and thorough understanding of the specific regulatory framework governing unlicensed spectrum use in the relevant jurisdiction. This includes identifying the permitted power levels, emission masks, and operational restrictions for devices operating in these bands. Implementing robust testing and validation procedures to ensure compliance before and during deployment is paramount. This demonstrates best professional practice by prioritizing legal adherence and responsible spectrum stewardship, thereby safeguarding both the service provider's operations and the integrity of the broader radio spectrum ecosystem. An incorrect approach would be to assume that because the spectrum is unlicensed, there are no significant regulatory hurdles. This overlooks the fundamental principle that even unlicensed spectrum is regulated to prevent harmful interference. Deploying small cells without verifying their compliance with specific power limits or emission standards, for instance, could lead to interference with critical licensed services like public safety communications or aviation navigation systems. Such an oversight represents a direct regulatory failure, violating the core tenets of spectrum management and potentially leading to severe legal and financial repercussions. Another incorrect approach might be to rely solely on vendor assurances of compliance without independent verification. While vendors play a role, the ultimate responsibility for regulatory compliance rests with the deploying service provider. Neglecting independent validation exposes the provider to risks if the vendor's equipment or specifications are not fully compliant with the governing regulations. This is an ethical failure, as it abdicates responsibility for due diligence. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a comprehensive review of all applicable regulations for the target deployment region. This should be followed by rigorous technical assessment of the proposed small cell technology against these regulations, including independent testing where necessary. Continuous monitoring and auditing of deployed equipment are also crucial to ensure ongoing compliance. This systematic and diligent approach ensures that business objectives are met without compromising legal and ethical obligations. Question 19. Comparative studies suggest that service providers often face challenges in optimizing unlicensed small cell deployments for maximum capacity while strictly adhering to regulatory mandates. Considering the U.S. regulatory framework for unlicensed spectrum, which of the following approaches best balances the service provider's operational goals with their legal obligations? Option A. Utilizing dynamic frequency selection, DFS, features only when mandated by specific regulations for certain bands, and otherwise operating on preferred channels without active spectrum sensing or interference mitigation. Option B. Implementing small cells that are configured to operate within the specific power limits, emission masks, and duty cycle restrictions defined by the FCC for the relevant unlicensed bands, and conducting regular spectrum analysis to ensure ongoing compliance. Option C. Deploying small cells with the highest possible transmit power and widest channel bandwidth to maximize data throughput, assuming that minor interference is an acceptable trade-off for enhanced user experience. Option D. Relying solely on the vendor's certification of the small cell equipment as compliant with FCC Part 15 rules, without performing any independent verification or ongoing monitoring of the deployed devices. The correct answer is C. Deploying small cells with the highest possible transmit power and widest channel bandwidth to maximize data throughput, assuming that minor interference is an acceptable trade-off for enhanced user experience. Explanation. Scenario analysis. Deploying unlicensed small cells in a service provider's network presents a complex challenge due to the inherent shared nature of the unlicensed spectrum. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the need for increased capacity and coverage with the obligation to operate within the established regulatory boundaries for unlicensed bands. Failure to do so can lead to interference with other users, potential service degradation for all, and significant regulatory penalties. The dynamic nature of unlicensed spectrum, where many devices compete for airtime, necessitates a proactive and compliant approach to deployment and management. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding and strict adherence to the regulatory framework governing unlicensed spectrum use in the relevant jurisdiction. This includes, but is not limited to, power limits, emission masks, duty cycle restrictions, and any specific operational requirements mandated by the regulatory body. For example, in the U.S., Federal Communications Commission, FCC, dictates these parameters under Part 15 of its rules. Best professional practice dictates that the service provider must ensure their small cell solutions are designed, configured, and operated in a manner that minimizes interference and complies with all technical and operational rules. This proactive compliance strategy safeguards the network's performance, avoids legal repercussions, and maintains the integrity of the shared spectrum for all users. Incorrect approach is analysis. Operating with an assumption that unlicensed spectrum is a free-for-all, without regard for specific regulatory limits, is a significant regulatory failure. This approach risks causing harmful interference to other licensed and unlicensed services, potentially leading to complaints, investigations, and fines from the regulatory authority. Another incorrect approach is to prioritize rapid deployment and capacity gains over regulatory compliance, perhaps by overlooking or downplaying the importance of specific technical parameters like transmit power or channel access mechanisms. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the legal framework, which can result in severe penalties and reputational damage. Furthermore, relying on vendor claims of compliance without independent verification or internal validation processes is also a failure. The service provider ultimately bears the responsibility for ensuring their deployed equipment operates within the legal parameters, regardless of vendor assurances. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field must adopt a risk-aware and compliance-first mindset. The decision-making process should begin with a comprehensive review of the applicable regulatory framework for unlicensed spectrum in the target deployment region. This involves identifying all relevant technical and operational requirements. Subsequently, the chosen small cell solutions must be rigorously evaluated against these requirements. This evaluation should include understanding the device's capabilities, its configuration options, and its operational behavior in real-world conditions. Any deployment plan must incorporate mechanisms for ongoing monitoring and verification of compliance. When faced with ambiguity or potential conflicts between performance goals and regulatory constraints, professionals should err on the side of caution and seek clarification from regulatory bodies or legal counsel if necessary. Prioritizing compliance ensures long-term network stability, avoids legal entanglements, and upholds ethical responsibilities in managing shared resources. Question 20. Compliance review shows that a service provider is planning to deploy 5 GHz unlicensed small cells in a region known to have significant radar activity. The deployment plan focuses on maximizing signal strength and coverage without explicitly detailing how potential interference with radar systems will be managed. What is the most critical regulatory consideration for this deployment? Option A. Ensuring the small cells utilize dynamic frequency selection, DFS, to detect and avoid radar operations. Option B. Obtaining explicit permission from any nearby licensed spectrum users before deployment. Option C. Verifying that the small cells operate within the maximum transmit power limits specified for unlicensed devices. Option D. Confirming that the small cells have a low duty cycle to minimize their presence in the spectrum. The correct answer is A. Ensuring the small cells utilize dynamic frequency selection, DFS, to detect and avoid radar operations. Explanation: scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent complexity of unlicensed spectrum operation and the need to balance service deployment with regulatory compliance. The core difficulty lies in ensuring that the deployed small cells, while operating in unlicensed bands, do not cause harmful interference to other licensed services or other unlicensed devices. This requires a deep understanding of the specific regulatory framework governing unlicensed spectrum use in the relevant jurisdiction, which for this exam is the United States, governed by the FCC. Misinterpreting or overlooking these regulations can lead to significant penalties, service disruption, and damage to the service provider's reputation. The pressure to rapidly deploy services in unlicensed bands for cost-effectiveness and coverage extension must be carefully managed against the absolute priority of adhering to these rules. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a proactive and thorough assessment of the deployment environment and the technical characteristics of the small cell solution against the specific FCC Part 15 rules for unlicensed personal communication service, PCS, devices operating in the 5 GHz band. This includes verifying that the devices comply with power limits, duty cycle restrictions, and antenna gain limitations. Crucially, it necessitates implementing mechanisms for detecting and avoiding interference with existing licensed services, such as radar systems, which are often protected in these bands. This might involve employing dynamic frequency selection, DFS, capabilities as mandated by the FCC for certain devices operating in these frequencies. Adhering to these technical requirements and employing interference mitigation techniques is the cornerstone of lawful operation in unlicensed spectrum and represents best professional practice. Incorrect approaches analysis. Deploying small cells without verifying their compliance with FCC Part 15 power limits and emission masks is a direct violation of regulatory requirements. This failure to adhere to technical specifications can lead to harmful interference, resulting in regulatory action and potential fines. Implementing small cells that do not incorporate or properly configure DFS mechanisms when operating in frequency bands where it is mandated, e.g., certain 5 GHz channels, is a significant regulatory failure. DFS is designed to protect licensed radar systems from interference, and its absence or malfunction is a critical compliance issue. Assuming that operation in unlicensed spectrum inherently means no interference concerns, and therefore skipping any form of interference analysis or mitigation strategy is a dangerous oversight. Unlicensed bands are shared, and while regulations aim to minimize interference, proactive measures are still required to ensure coexistence, especially with sensitive licensed services. This approach ignores the shared nature of the spectrum and the potential for significant disruption. Professional reasoning. Professionals tasked with deploying mobile unlicensed small cell solutions must adopt a risk-based, compliance-first approach. This involves 1. Thoroughly understanding the specific regulatory framework, FCC Part 15 in the U.S., for the target unlicensed bands. 2. Verifying that the chosen small cell hardware and software meet all technical specifications and certifications. 3. Implementing and configuring features like DFS and transmit power control, TPC, as required by the regulations. 4. Conducting site surveys and interference assessments where necessary. 5. Establishing ongoing monitoring and reporting mechanisms to ensure continued compliance. The decision-making process should prioritize regulatory adherence over speed of deployment or perceived cost savings, as noncompliance carries severe consequences.